Hi y'all, we're back with part two from Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class, for Women's History Month. So let's get into it. So chapter 7 is titled Woman Suffrage at the Turn of the Century, the Rising Influence of Racism. So she was pretty much she was talking about black women's advocacy from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. Um, and it starts off with this conversation between Susan B. Anthony and Ida B. Wells, in which Ida B. Wells, for those of y'all who don't know, she was an anti-lynching activist. So there were so many lynchings that were happening, especially after the Civil War and during the Jim Crow segregation laws were becoming more prevalent, that Ida B. Wells pretty much documented all the lynchings and tried to draw solutions on how to combat lynching. And it's also tied that to how American chattel slavery and how the United States and the government have been treating black people, because so many black people were neglected, and after emancipation, and because of convict leasing, because of the unemployment discrimination and all that black people were going through, and how that needs to be discussed in the suffragist movements. And suffragists, especially Susan B. Anthony, were indifferent to this racial violence. So there were like race riots that were massacres and pogroms that were orchestrated by white people to burn black communities. So there was Wilmington, there was Tulsa, there was Detroit. There was so many massacres that happened. Like Lauren Michelle Jackson's White Negroes went into more details about how many massacres were happening. But Angela Davis was talking about the Wilmington massacre, because she said like the Holocaust is nothing compared to like the violence that was happening in the Wilmington massacre. So that's something that I didn't really learn about too much until I did my readings about these massacres. But it's astounding and devastating to know that this is stuff that was happening after slavery, and apparently the white suffragists felt like there's no need to go into that, even though they need to realize it's the same enemy that's destroying those communities are the reason why they're protesting such a system. And then modern racism as we know it started to manifest. So there was institutional segregation, which is still like going on in our education systems. Like predominantly black schools get treated worse than predominantly white schools when it comes to like getting services for or mental health, academic development and achievement, and the police and prison system, like what schools tend to have police around the schools. So stuff like that is like you need an analysis for all of that, and how they're all connected to anti-blackness. And then she was talking about how the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was reversed during that time. So even though there were things that were trying to promote progress, the government reversed some of those things. Like they like you literally had to watch what the type of laws that the government tries to pass, because some of them just don't mean nothing. It's like it's just only cute for the moment, and then they will eventually take it away. And then lynch laws were happening, and there was bourgeois feminism. It got it got more common with bourgeois feminism, and why some people didn't go along with the feminist movement, especially working class women, white and black, because there was no class analysis and a race analysis to these movements. And then imperialism was happening. There was U.S. Sanctions in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, and Hawaii. So I think that's how Hawaii pretty much became a United States state, because of neocolonialism and imperialist ventures that the United States put on Hawaii, because it wasn't always a United States territory. Like, it became a United States territory in the 20th century. So it's pretty much talking about the expansion of militarism and how the United States is becoming more of an empire that people fail to recognize even today. And then she went into more anti-blackness within suffrage movement. I think she was talking about the NAWSA, which was, I think it was the National American Women's Suffrage Association. I think that's the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And it's notably white women in leadership and membership. And they mistreated Lottie Wilson Jackson. Let me see if I found her. Lottie Wilson Jackson. But Lottie Wilson Jackson was pretty much telling white women they're being white women. and I think she became more radical. Like, she's known for her speeches and stuff like that. But powerful people got in the way and banned her from coming into circles. And it's like the same old thing when it comes to people that are trying to advocate for change. They get shunned and censored. And then she was talking about how violent lynching and these race massacres have been. So how notably all these things are happening in the South, even though there's racism in the North, the specific violence is in the South. That's why stuff like the Great Migration happened. Like, a lot of black people migrated from the South because of the trauma that racism put on them. And like, that's why sometimes there's this hostility to the South. Like, especially during this past presidential election, people were talking about how Georgia is always going to be red. Mississippi is always going to be red. Florida is always going to be red. And then people be saying, like, okay, y'all deserve these natural disasters. Y'all deserve to not have clean water. And it's like, y'all not realizing the anti-blackness y'all are literally perpetrating. Y'all trying to claim, y'all trying to fight against. And David said stuff like that isn't new. Like people have always had this hostility towards the South because of these historical moments that has historically harmed black people and people that are in poor and working class. And yeah, I think that was in for that. Then we got into racism in the 20th century. So Davis said, when the new century rolled around, a serious ideological marriage had linked racism and sexism in a new way. White supremacy and male supremacy, which had always had an easy courtship, openly embraced and consolidated the affair. During the first years of the 20th century, the influence of racist ideas was stronger than ever. The intellectual climate, even in progressive circles, seemed to be fatally infected with irrational notions about the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. This escalated promotion of racist propaganda was accompanied by a similarly accelerated promotion of ideas implying female inferiority. If people of color at home and abroad were portrayed as incompetent barbarians, women, white women that is, were more rigorously depicted as mother figures whose fundamental raison d'etre was the nurturing of the male of the species. White women were learning that as mothers they bore a very special responsibility in the struggle to safeguard white supremacy. So the mothers of white supremacy, oh, that's why y'all the way they are. And after all, they were the mothers of the race. Although the term race allegedly referred to the human race in practice, especially as the eugenics movement grew in popularity, little distinction was made between the race and the Anglo-Saxon race. So getting into the eugenics movement, it's like, to put it plainly, it's pseudoscience to justify white supremacy, and that's how we pretty much got white supremacy, is because of eugenics and what white anthropologists what they interpreted and analyzed when they were going to an African society. They were saying they were uncivilized, they were barbaric, they were primitive savages, and they justified like they needed to be taught something. They needed to be taught some skills, and that's how slavery got to be slavery. And then and she's talking about how those ideas are still like passed around to today, because there's still some white people that believe like they're superior and black people are inferior. And it's called race science. So it's so what book was I talking about on where was it Sister Outsider? I think it was Sister Outsider, where it talks about how black people's heads or brains tend to be smaller, so that's why they're dumb or something. So it's like some stupid stuff. It makes no sense. Like there's no real science behind those analyses. And what was happening then? There was the speech by Bell Kearney, who I think is a legislator. And Davis said, at the 1903 convention, it was Bell Kearney from Mississippi whose remarks most blatantly confirmed the dangerous alliance between racism and sexism, bluntly referring to the Southern black population as the 4,500,000 ex-slaves, illiterate and semi-barbarous. So things like illiteracy, they're not saying they're illiterate because of institutional racism, the lack of opportunities that black people got. Is just they're inherently illiterate. They're inherently not smart. So things were used to justify racism too. And then Davis said she histrionically, these words, evoked their enfranchisement as a death weight, under which the South has struggled for nearly 40 years, bravely and magnanimously. However, inadequate Booker T. Washington's theory of vocational education for black people may have been in reality. Kearney insisted that Tuskegee and similar schools were only fitting the Negro for power, and when the black man becomes necessary to a community by reason of his school and acquired wealth, something of a race war will result. So they also use like this idea, like because of the eugenics movement, they feel like black people, there's this fear that white people have, like the white race is going to be eventually be the minority. So they use such violent ideas and methods and strategies to justify black death too. So that's why we need to like get rid of eugenics and abolish that. And then there's this idea that there's going to be a race war. So they're like black people are going to be out of control. Like they're probably fearing for another Nat Turner slave rebellion. So that's what they're insinuating, and it's just hysterical what the things they believe. And then Davis said they needed to impede working class unity so as to facilitate their own exploitative designs. And that was reminding me of Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow on how we have the political parties that we have today to separate white working class from from black slaves, because there was a moment at time where they understood that the common enemy is the bourgeoisie and elites. But then the elites had these strategies where they use like anecdotes, they use stories, they use like this thing called the Southern Strategy that the 13th documentary by Ava DuVernay explained. But there's this fear mongering that white they tend to be white elites do to white poor and working class people to justify anti-blackness and why they should be anti-black. And they use that for electoral purposes too. They use that for capitalist reasons. They use that to fit their imperialist propaganda. So it's just stuff that wasn't new. I forgot what was the story. I think it was the Bacon's Rebellion. So look up the Bacon Rebellion. That was what Michelle Alexander talked about in the New Jim Crow, and this is the same thing that Angela Davis was talking about here. And then that was it for chapter 7. So then we have chapter 8, which I learned so much from chapter 8. It was talking about black women in the club movement. So look up women's club movement. It's talking about there was these discourses, there was these groups of women. They were talking about women's issues. It's like a political and social and cultural activist and organizing historical moment that was happening with this. It was a women's club movement that was going on, and they were talking. It's pretty much like little congresses. Like they were discussing ideas, they created an agenda, and they tried to figure out how to accomplish those goals. And that's like and it reminds me of like how important it was for like something like a black student union at a college university to give a sense of camaraderie and a sense of community for black college students, and especially in a predominantly white institution, and thinking about how we're living in a white supremacist cis heteropatriarchal society, how important it was for those spaces to be had, how important it was to have these club movements. And the women's club movement, predominantly white women were leading them, especially bourgeois. They tend to be fancy too. So they were notably excluding black women. So black women had to create their own club movements and create their own agendas that not only have a race and not have a race that not only center race, they center race, gender, class, and any other systems of oppression, because there's so many things, they have so many things they had to overcome in this society. So they had to understand the struggles of and experiences of pretty much the people that are the most marginalized, because at face value they are the most marginalized. And then let me see what else is there. Yeah, she was talking about how there tends to be a hierarchy and a class barriers in these women's clubs. So the people who tends to be in leadership tends to be the richest people. And then the black women led clubs, she said something so profound here. Yeah, she said here, when the first National Conference of Colored Women convened in Boston in 1895, the black club women were not simply emulating their white counterparts who had federated the club movement 5 years earlier. They had come together to decide upon a strategy of resistance to the current propagandistic assaults on black women and a continued reign of lynch law. Responding to an attack on Ida B. Wells by the pro-lynching president of the Missouri Press Association, the conference delegates protested that insult to Negro womanhood and sent out to the country a unanimous endorsement of the course had pursued in agitation against lynching. And Fannie Barrier Williams, whom white women in Chicago had excluded from their club, summed up the difference between the white club movement and the club movement among her people. Black women, she said, had come to realize that progress includes a great deal more than was generally meant by the terms culture, education, and contact. The club movement among colored women reaches into the subcondition of the entire race. The club movement is only one of the many means for the social uplift of a race. The club movement is well-purposed. It is not a fad. It is rather the force of a new intelligence against the old ignorance, the struggle of an enlightened conscience against the whole brood of social miseries, born out of the stress and pain of a hated past. So, not only were black club women using the club movement as a sense of community, they use it as a sense of political education. They use it as a sense to generate a consciousness with the masses. And then it also led to them to contribute to organizing and community empowerment. So, Davis also talking about the class divisions that were happening here. She said here, Fannie Barrier Williams, for example, envisioned a club women as the new intelligence, the enlightened conscience of the race. Among white women, clubs mean the forward movement of the best women in the interest of the best womanhood. Among colored women, the club is the effort of the few incompetents in behalf of the many incompetents. So this is when it gets to like a classist analysis. Prior to the definitive establishment of a national black women's club organization, there was apparently some unfortunate competition among leading club women. Based on the 1895 Boston Conference called by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, the National Federation of Afro-American Women was founded the same year, electing Margaret Murray Washington as its president. It brought together over 30 clubs, which were active in 12 states. In 1895, the National League of Colored Women was founded in Washington, D.C., with Mary Church Terrell as its president. The competing organizations soon emerged, however, forming the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which elected Terrell to its highest office. Over the next several years, Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells would express a mutual hostility within the National Black Club movement. In her autobiography, Wells claims that Terrell was personally responsible for exclusion from the 1899 convention of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs that was held in Chicago. According to Wells, Terrell's fears about her own re-election as president caused her to exclude the former newspaper woman and to minimize during the convention the struggle against lynching, which her rival had come to personify. So, even if you're a black woman, you can fail to have a class analysis too, which Mary Church Terrell, according to Ida B. Wells, failed to recognize, because Mary Church Terrell didn't have like the knowledge, didn't have the dedication in towards learning about the violence of lynching and how it's mainly affecting black people that were poor and working class in the South. So Ida B. Wells recognized like, it's like what's going on with organizing. Like, sometimes it's just necessary to struggle and hold each other accountable, because that's how you build the society that you all want. It's the society where you're all going to be liberated and free. Like, it's important to have these constructive criticisms towards people, especially when it's people who share identities with you. Like, Ida B. Wells politically has different politics compared to Mary Church Terrell, but she also recognized how important it was for Mary Church Terrell to be involved in these movements, because she understands the experiences of black women and what they had to go through, regardless of class. Like, regardless of class, black women had to endured misogynoir in their lifetime. So, that was that. And then chapter 9 is titled Working Women, Black Women and the History of the Suffrage Movement. So, Davis was going into how the labor force started to expand, and there were unionization efforts to increase wages, especially after the Civil War. So, I learned this not too long ago. Like, people used to have to work, the type of jobs we have to work for that are like 8 hours and stuff like that. People back then, they had to work, if not 12 hours, have to work 12 hours and not the entire day. Like, they barely have a moment where they can rest. So there was a moment where they advocated for 8-hour days and equal pay and equal work. That was always something that women struggled with. And then Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not only they lacked a race analysis, but they lacked a class analysis. But it also motivated people to get involved electorally to fight for wages they feel like they deserve and needed to make ends meet and survive. So and then let me see. Yeah, here's what Davis said about Susan B. Anthony. Anthony's staunchly feminist position was also a staunch reflection of bourgeois ideology, and it was probably because of the ideology's blinding powers that she failed to realize that working class women and black women alike were fundamentally linked to their men by the class exploitation and racist oppression, which did not discriminate between the sexes. While their men's sexist behavior definitely needed to be challenged, the real enemy, their common enemy, was the boss, the capitalist, or whoever was responsible for the miserable wages and unbearable working conditions and for racist and sexist discrimination on the job. So, I can't put it more eloquent as Angela Davis put it about we all have the same enemy that needs to be defeated and challenged. Like, if we're having this hostility towards each other and willing and letting pride and ego get in the way of the knowledge that we need to obtain and the education that we need to be educate and that we need to learn from, we're going to be stuck in the same system over and over for generations to generations. And unfortunately, we're still in that same system that Susan B. Anthony wished she had to, because she didn't have the analysis. Like, because she's a notable white feminist in a sense where she fails to recognize the experiences of black people, specifically after slavery, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton too. So, white women, check yourselves. And then, the next is centering black women votes and voices. So it was pretty much the fight for black women's right to vote, because like when the 19th Amendment was passed, it didn't think about the electoral power for black women, because like even though black men had the right to vote, they were still having to go through like poll taxes, literacy tests, like the same stuff they were fighting, the stuff they were fighting for in the Selma March in 1965. So it was pretty much talking about how political power is not prioritized in of black people through the government. And then Davis said black women have been more than willing to contribute those clear powers of observation and judgment toward the creation of a multiracial movement for women's political rights. But at every turn, they were portrayed, sparred, spurned and rejected by the leaders of the lily white woman suffrage movement. For suffragists and club women alike, black women were simply expendable entities when it came time to woo Southern support with a white complexion. As for the women's suffrage campaign, it appears that all those concessions to Southern women made very little difference in the end. When the votes on the 19th Amendment were tallied, the Southern states were still lined up in the opposition camp, and in fact almost managed to defeat the amendment. So that's chapter 9. So talks about it's like I learned so much history from especially that chapter, because a lot of this stuff I didn't know until I read the book, because I didn't really learn about specific black women history until some of college and the books I'm reading right now, especially this book. And now chapter 10 is titled Communist Women. So Davis was paying homage to notable women that were that were communists, and things wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for these women. It wouldn't the type of organizing, the type of political education we would have had. If it wasn't for these women, we wouldn't have the discourse that we have when it comes to community organizing and fighting for a transformation of a society and abolishing institutions of oppression. And then so she started off with Marxism, how Marxism came to be in Europe, and Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. So you have to learn about Karl Marx for to get to understand this chapter. And then she talked about how people were still trying to learn Karl Marx ideas. But when it came to like people who were working, socialism became attractive because they wanted like higher wages and stuff like that. But then there were social movements and mass demonstration that had to be done for workers to get the wages that they wanted and get the protections that they deserve for just working and existing. But for those who don't know, International Women's Day, it wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for women socialists that were active on New York's Lower East Side that organized a mass demonstration in support of equal suffrage. So if it wasn't for socialist women, we wouldn't have International Women's Day. But it's specifically International Working Women's Day because it's pretty much giving space and attention to the women that were working, the women that went through such harsh conditions that they never got the humanity that they deserved. And then she was talking about the struggles that are going on in leftism and leftist movements. So we all know that there's the Communist Party, there was a Socialist Party, there was the International Workers of the World Party, there's a Worker Families Parties. Like she was getting into why all of these people are supposedly, you would think they would have the same goals and ideas, why they are fragmented and why they have different parties. But Davis got into like the historical accounts. Like socialism hasn't always had white socialists tend to take on these, white leftists tend to be taking on these leadership roles in these parties and political ideologies, and some of them they didn't have the race analysis for it. So the International Workers of the World Party, I think it was the first party that kind of included Black people's issues and provided solutions on what to do to liberate not just Black people but all oppressed groups and peoples. So that was something I never knew until reading this. And then she acknowledged Helen Holman, who was black socialist. Um, She said, as a black woman, however, Helen Holman was a rarity within the ranks of the Socialist Party. Prior to the World War II, the numbers of black women working in industry were negligible. As a consequence, they were all but ignored by Socialist Party recruiters. The socialist posture of negligence vis-a-vis black women was one of the unfortunate legacies the Communist Party would have to overcome. So, then I think also the International Workers of the World were like the first to have women leadership in a communist party. So that's something that's fun. That's a fun fact of it. And Helen Holman was a notable black woman socialist. And then I'm not gonna get into like the nitty gritty of all these women, but these are some very powerful women that should be recognized every day. Like if it wasn't for the struggle, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have the intellect. Some people wouldn't have had the intellect they would have today. So Angela was talking about Lucy Parsons, Ella Reeve Bloor, Anita Whitney, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and Claudia Jones. And Claudia Jones, y'all need to read An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman. That's pretty much talking about the triple oppression of working class women, the racism, the misogyny, and the classism that they experience. And it's another notable black feminist foundational text that I think if you call yourself wanting to be a black feminist, you have to read that along with the Combahee River Collective statement. You have to read that and the Claudia Jones article, because those are essential. There's some essential knowledge that everyone needs to learn to get into this type of work. And a lot of these women, they been targeted by the government. A lot of them were incarcerated. A lot of them were just understood that the status quo needs to be getting rid of. Like they are abolitionists. When it in the and not in the American chattel slavery context, they're an abolitionist of what the system that tolerated slavery put into other systems and put into other institutions, and how all those things need to be abolished. So Davis got a nice homage and tribute for them. And then chapter 11, trigger warning, mention of rape and sexual assault. So this chapter is titled Rape, Racism, and the Myth of the Black Rapist. So she started off with the rape culture and the racialized rape narrative, how rape has been racialized, and it never considers the experiences that black female slaves endured from their white slave masters, because there are so many reasons that put them in that position, whether it's like punishment, whether it's they didn't meet the desires of the white slave master. But pretty much like they're literally treated as only sex objects. They're only there is this hypersexualization that black women had to endure, this fetish for black women that has a historical violent history to it, and how rape and sexual violence created such a hostile experience for a black woman, especially a black woman who's poor and working class, and so much of it is normalized even today. And Davis went into the sexual violence from police, because we have to understand stuff like stop and frisk, even even though it's not too many black women that went through stop and frisk, that's sexual harassment and of stop and frisk, because you're literally it all goes down to consent. If there's no consent, it's sexually violent. And then she's talking about the erasure of black women in anti-rape movements, because white women, that's something that white women understood. Like, rape is something that should not be tolerated and needs to be abolished. So you have to talk about how the institution of slavery tolerates all these acts of sexual violence too, if you want to get into anti-rape movements. So it's this history also with black men being falsely accused of rape, and sometimes it led to all these lynchings too. So there was a lot of black, because it's all about this it's a pseudo protection of white womanhood and white femininity of sexual violence, that it like a white woman was probably raped or something like that, but it may not be that's a specific. A black man was punished and lynched for so-calling raping that white woman, and that white woman was probably raped, but it wasn't that black man. That specific black man might have been another black man. It might have been a white man or something like that, because there's a sexual violence that white men that they are socialized to. Well, men in general are socialized to rape culture as a whole, but it's a specific experience for black men and a specific experience for white men, because sometimes rape was used as like a rite of passage for manhood. So that's goes into how violent patriarchy and male supremacy normalize such things. And let me see if I have a quote. Oh, the Vietnam War. I didn't know this until I think I learned about this somewhere, but Angela Davis was talking about how in the Vietnam War, the military, they don't consider Vietnamese people human beings. So they allowed such torture to happen to some Vietnamese people, especially Vietnamese women. Like people that were fighting in Vietnam raped Vietnamese women, and the so-called protection of American democracy, they've been raping people abroad too. So that's something like the anti-rape movement also has to address. It needs to be against imperialism. It needs to be against militarism. It needs to be against racism. So yeah, it's just interesting what it's not even something that they tolerated. It's something that they advocated for. They launched campaigns to do these type of stuff, and it's really infuriating. And then there were also mob rapes, like during lynchings and stuff like that. Especially when for a black woman, before they lynch her, there were gang rapes, there were mob rapes that were happening to black women, especially in the South, and before they get lynched. So that's something that's also it's really upsetting that something like this I had to learn from reading Angela Davis, and we don't talk about how dangerous sexual violence is has been really much normalized throughout history. So yeah, so the next thing is this idea of a black woman fake victimhood. So it's pretty much this justification. So we all know, like, the things when someone comes out about sexual violence, people try to justify what's going on. Like, why are you out at night? Why are you wearing such loose clothes? Why are you pretty much been asking for rape or something like that, like triggering stuff like that. So through the experience of, like, black women, noted, like, there's this hypersexualization of black women, like, from like even coming down to contemporary moments where, like, twerking or something like that, people hypersexualize that and feel like that's justifiable for rape. And it's like, y'all are literally attacking the person that has been harmed. Y'all not attacking the harm doer. Like, and it's so normalized. It's so institutionalized, and, like, it goes into, like, legislation and stuff like that. And Davis said, throughout the history of this country, black women have manifested a collective consciousness of their sexual victimization. They have also understood that they cannot adequately resist the sexual abuses they suffered without simultaneously attacking the fraudulent rape charge as a pretext for lynching. The reliance on rape as an instrument of white supremacist terror predates by several centuries the institution of lynching. During slavery, the lynching of black people did not occur extensively, for the simple reason that slave owners were reluctant to destroy their valuable property. Flogging, yes, but lynching, no. Together with flogging, rape was a terribly efficient method of keeping black women and men alike in check. It was a routine arm of repression. And she also gave room to understand, like, the sexual violence that black men also endured. Like, we don't, like, that also needs to be discussed if we're going to attack rape culture as a whole, because there's stuff that has affected black men, but for black women, it's an everyday experience sometimes, a lot. And then yeah, so that's also what helped Ida B. Wells get into her anti-lynching campaign. So because she also noted how sexual violence has been contributing to such oppression. So not only with domestic service, but literally just people existing in the South. So she helped mobilize. So she used the experiences of rape and sexual violence to make Southern white women understand why they need to get into the anti-lynching campaigns, because if the most oppressed isn't free, no one is free. Like, we're not, like, if you're just worrying about your issues and not the people that suffer even the worst of violences, like, that, you're still going to allow that culture to exist. So you need to get into those type of movements as well. And then Davis had a critique of this woman named Susan Brown Miller. Susan Brown Miller is a white feminist and was using sexual violence in a racist type of narrative. For examples, we need to learn about. I know everyone learned about Emmett Till and the Scottsboro Nine, who were, as of today, we know, like, it was false sexual violence claims that drove them to the state violence that they suffered. And she also used Eldridge Cleaver, who is who was a rapist, and Amari Baraka, who had some problematic poems when it came to like sexual violence or stuff like that, and she was using those to justify the black rapist myth, the false the racist manipulation when it came to sexual violence. So so she pretty much called Susan out on that. And then Angela was trying to tie rape and sexual violence to capitalism, and say how to get rid of rape, you have to get rid of capitalism. And Davis said the class structure of capitalism encourages men who wield power in the economic and political realm to become routine agents of sexual exploitation. The present rape epidemic occurs at a time when the capitalist class is furiously reasserting its authority in face of the global and internal challenges. Both racism and sexism, central to its domestic strategy of increased economic exploitation, are receiving unprecedented encouragement. It is not a mere coincidence that as the incidence of rape has arisen, the position of women workers has visibly worsened. So severe are women's economic losses that their wages in relationship to men are lower than they were a decade ago. The proliferation of sexual violence is the brutal face of a generalized intensification of the sexism which necessarily accompanies this economic assault. So she's pretty much talking about how class capitalism thrives off of misogyny and racism and in a material and specific context. And she also said, as the basis of the license to rape black women during slavery was the slaveholders' economic power, so the class structure of capitalist society also harbors an incentive to rape. It seems, in fact, that men of the capitalist class and their middle-class partners are immune to prosecution because they commit their sexual assaults with the same unchallenged authority that legitimizes their daily assaults on the labor and dignity of working people. So that was chapter 11, which was very triggering. I'm glad anyone who endured that chapter. It was a lot to get through, but it was stuff that you need to learn because it's happening right now. And now we're getting into a chapter where I also learned some things. I didn't learn this until I read this book. Is chapter 12, titled Racism, Birth Control, and Reproductive Rights. So this was going into the birth control movement, which has been happening for a long time prior to Roe versus Wade. And then it's talking about voluntary motherhood. So it's pretty much emphasizing women wanting to give birth. Do they feel like they need to have they want to have a child? Do they feel like they have the support to take care of a child? So thinking of like free childcare or something like socialized childcare, something like that should be discussed in women's circles, not just women's circles, but every circle when it comes to organizing against a system of oppression. But she went into like how voluntary motherhood was like something that white women were focusing, and black women they don't always have that luxury. Sometimes people have children for economic purposes. Sometimes they have children to trying to have someone to take care. Like sometimes it's not the right reasons why people have children, but you understand like they don't have all their needs met. But it's important to have like. It's nice to have like the desire to have children. It's nice to like create something that will carry on for another generation. Like that's something can be special when you have children, but guarantee like children is something that you should volunteer yourself to get. So that's what white women were trying to push for, and that's not like the movement that it's a movement that Black women recognize, but it's something like that's not always the case for them. So considering like the welfare system and stuff like that. And then when it got to like abortion rights campaigns, that's when it got kind of touchy. So Davis said, when Black and Latina women resort to abortions in such large numbers, the stories they tell are not so much about their desire to be free of their pregnancy, but rather about the miserable social conditions which dissuade them from bringing new lives into the world. So it was the same thoughts that Ashada Shakur was having in her autobiography on bringing a child into the world. Like, why would I bring a child in such a hateful and anti-Black, anti-woman, anti-working, anti-poor society. So I think that's a reasonable explanation on why some people chose to not have children, because they feel like the society that they're going to put them in is going to be violent, like police violence, there's sexual violence, there's all types of stuff that are harmful, and it'll make people not want to go through life. And then it's not always that voluntary motherhood narrative that white women had. It's literally like stuff that Davis was expressing here. And then she was talking about how because of the denial of such abortion protections and abortion rights that specifically Black women and poor women had to go through, they had to take it upon themselves to do some birth prevention themselves. Like they came up with these birth preventive lotions. Like, I just learned this. Like, they created all these chemicals and stuff to and considering the medical racism that Black women went through, like, it's something that they had to take it upon themselves to create such measures that are amazing, but at the same time pretty terrifying, like, and sad that they went through. And then there was this race suicide that white people were worried about. Like, they're like when it came to like abortion and stuff like that, they kind of pushed that onto Black people too. It's why some people are skeptic about abortion as we know it, because they don't see like abortion. They see like abortion as like population control or something like that. And some white people did use that, but it's not the purpose for a person that wants to have abortion, a typical person who wants to have abortion. And then Margaret Sanger, who y'all should learn about when it comes to birth control education. She's a notable activist that tries to educate people about birth control and other contraceptive measures that women who want to have children or do not have the capacity to have children, how they can access someone to get some education about birth control and what if they feel like they're ready to get. And also, there were these birth and sex strikes that women try to have to push how important abortion rights and birth control, how pressing the birth control is to have women have some autonomy with their bodies. So that's pretty much what's going on. That's what happened then. And then going back into the eugenics movement and how that justified compulsory sterilizations that Black women went through. Like, Angela Davis went into the stories of Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Relf, who were teenagers when they were sterilized without the informed knowledge that their mother faced, because their mother did not understand like the sterilization procedure, so they sterilized her daughters, and that's literally medical violence right there. And it led to things like the Hyde Amendment to to exist. For those who don't know, the Hyde Amendment is pretty much like government control about a government regulation about whether someone gets an abortion or not, and that's pretty much taking away their autonomy and their need and desire to get an abortion. So that's something that still exists today. And let me see if I have any other quotes. And Davis didn't even talk about Black women's experiences. Sterilization abuse is something that happens to Native American women, Chicana women, Puerto Rican women. Like, it's something that affects not just white women, but all women and people who pretty much want to give birth. Like, I'm trying to think of trans men who give birth and stuff like that. So it's a certain experience that they went through. Davis didn't mention trans men because granted this was 1981, so the knowledge of trans men and reproductive justice it still needs to be learned about, and not just trans men, but probably trans masculine and non-binary people who want to give birth, who can give birth. So that leads to the final chapter, which is the approaching obsolescence of housework, a working class perspective. So we already touched into the evolution of industrialization and socialization of housework, and how housework has went from like just a home economy, just something that's socialized, to industrialized, like we got domestic service and stuff like that. So and the exploitation that they went through, the mistreatment and negligence that they went through when it comes to labor movements, when it comes to women's rights issues and stuff like that. So that's what Davis was getting into. And she mentioned how housework in the colonial era, she said like housework was something that housewives, they take care of the home. It could be all day. They do housework pretty much every day. Like, they barely get a break. Like, and it's for industrial and capitalist and economic pressures and reasons. So Davis said, the source of the bourgeois notion of woman as man's internal servant is itself a revealing story. Within a relatively short history of the United States, the housewife as a furnished historical product is just a little more than a century old. Housework during the colonial era was entirely different from the daily work routine of the housewife in the United States today. A woman's work began at sunup and continued by firelight as long as she could hold her eyes open. For 2 centuries, almost everything that the family used or ate was produced at home under her direction. She spun and dyed the yarn that she wove into cloth and cut and hand-stitched into garments. She grew much of the food her family ate and preserved enough to last the winter months. She made butter, cheese, bread, candles, and soap, and knitted her family stockings. So it was talking about how housework during colonial period, it was very different. Like, they did like all these jobs. Like, not only they took care of the house, they took care of they made the food from scratch and stuff like that. And that's pre-industrialization. Like, we didn't have like manufactured goods and stuff like that to that capacity yet. And then she said, in the agrarian economy of pre-industrial North America, a woman performing her household chores was thus a spinner, weaver, and seamstress, as well as a baker, butter churner, candle maker, and soap maker, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, the pressures of home production left very little time for the task that we will recognize today as housework. By all accounts, pre-industrial revolution women were sloppy housekeepers by today's standards. Instead of the daily cleaning or the weekly cleaning, there was the spring cleaning. Meals were simple and repetitive, clothes were changed infrequently, and household wash was allowed to accumulate, and the washing done once a month, or in some households once in 3 months. And of course, since each wash required the carting and heating of many buckets of water, higher standards of cleanliness were easily discouraged. So we got to a place where people didn't have to do the type of labor, or thank God, the women didn't have to do the type of labor they had to do back then, but it tells you like how they used to be. They used to be the farmers, they used to be the butter churners, they used to be all of those things that are single industries now, but they were doing all of those. And think about it, they were women, they were working class, they did not get the pay compared to today's industries. So yeah, she said colonial women were not house cleaners or housekeepers, but rather full-fledged and accomplished workers within the home-based economy. Not only did they manufacture most of the products required by their families, they were also the guardians of their families and their community's health. So she recognized, like, even though they shouldn't have to go through things, they did so much that are essential to the community, because it was based on the economy back then. It just, unfortunately, someone had to do it, and they had to be exploited, and that's sad and appalling, but it made us learn, like, something that just shouldn't have to happen in the first place. And then she talking about the resilience of and endurance of Black women since slavery, and how that should be taken into consideration in feminist movements. And we need to expand beyond the housewife role, the housewife boxes that white women were trying to avoid, and recognize the care and the compensation and the liberation that the Black women workers ever since slavery, they should have had in the first place. So that delves into how Black feminism is so different from white feminism, and when Black feminism and womanism. All right, and then how there's the wages for housework movement, and we see it gave us like another a broader look into housework, because Angela Davis said she saw housework as a precondition to industrial capitalism, because it was originally something where women were taking on all of these different roles, and now it's now a role where people can get paid to do, and they don't have to work as long. So it's gives into the industrialization of what the housework used to be. And she's talking about even today, even in the contemporary times when South Africa was going through apartheid, housework over there was still unprofitable. It was still not valued. So even talking about the post-colonial effects of something as like South Africa, there was still exploitation was happening. Like, they still practiced the behaviors and the systems that the colonialism that South Africa endured they were going through. So yeah, and Davis also said, while home manufactured goods were valuable primarily because they fulfilled basic family needs, the importance of factory-produced commodities resided overwhelmingly in their exchange value and their ability to fulfill employers' demands for profits. This reevaluation of economic production revealed, beyond a physical separation of home and factory, a fundamental structural separation between the domestic home economy and a profit-oriented economy of capitalism. Since housework does not generate profit, domestic labor was naturally defined as an inferior form of work as compared to capitalist wage labor. All right, and that's that on that. And then Davis said, taking into all consideration of all this violence, all the things that Black house workers went through, she was making an argument for a guaranteed annual income for all. And yeah, she said, it is not an implicit critique of the wages for housework movement that women on welfare have rarely demanded compensation for keeping house. Not wages for housework, but rather a guaranteed annual income for all is the slogan articulating the immediate alternative they have most frequently proposed to the dehumanizing welfare system. What they want in the long run, however, is jobs and affordable public child care. The guaranteed annual income functions, therefore, as unemployment insurance, depending the creation of more jobs with adequate wages, along with a subsidized system of child care. So think about implementing a guaranteed annual income for all. Your children will be taken care of. Your house will be you have the essentials to take care of your house. You will feel valued in your job. You will be valued in your labor. You will not have to feel exploited. You will not be harmed. You will not have opportunities for negligence and unprotection. So that's pretty much what Davis was calling for. And she pretty much used this to close out with how it's nice to have nice wages for housework, but thinking about how some people feel depressed when they do housework. Like, think of like this being their everyday thing, considering the hours, the time it takes to clean a house and stuff like that. Like that stuff is draining. Like, let's be real. Housework is a lot to do. It's a lot to deal with. It can drain you. It makes you suffer and stuff like that. So she was arguing for something that's socialized, not just that one person doing the role. If they desire to do housework, just give people more autonomy, and not housework being the only opportunity out there. But she wants to recognize the despair that Black domestic workers faced, and there was a decline of domestic workers that happened after the 60s, because they become the surrogate housewives, because they took care of white children and stuff like that. So she was talking about going beyond the wage and have an analysis of how this is a system that's made to put these people in these certain positions where they face so much violence, abuse, and mistreatment, and it creates a burden within them. And so it tries to, it aligns with like socialist and socialist ideologies. So that's Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class. So we're done. So thank y'all for being on this journey with me. This is a very historical book. I recommend anyone to read this. You'll get so much history about especially considering it's Women's History Month. This stuff you probably never learned in the classroom, stuff you probably were never taught about, because I learned so much from this. Like, there were things I never knew exist that happened prior to reading this book. So I encourage anyone to read this, because you'll definitely learn a lot. So yeah, so stay tuned for the next book that I'm going to be reading for the next video is Dolores S. Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk. She's a womanist theologian, so get into Black liberation theology again for the next video, and stay tuned for that. And thank y'all for considering this journey with me. Follow my personal Instagram at Intellectual Albert, and my reading list Instagram at Raisin Souls, and stay tuned for Sisters in the Wilderness. It'll be on the description box below, and y'all have a good day. All right.